Chapter 22. National Gallery, Monday the 4th of June, 2463. Killing all those bastards who enslaved us is as easy as eating noodles. If you can eat 10, you can eat 100. If you can eat 100, you can eat 1,000. Dongxi Bainan, Chinese revolutionary leader, 2200. When are you going to master horsemanship, young man? Lal was mocking James's attempts to mount his pony. He was trying to hoist himself up and then swing his weaker leg over the saddle. James glowered with indignation, but tried to grin nevertheless. The doctor was a good horseman and stabled 8 horses and 2 ponies. When young, he was a regular on the polo field until he had a fall and his grandmother had ordered him to stop. "Come along, James. Back straight, head up and knees in." He was in good spirits, James noted, and very much back to his old self. He too had heard the counter-rumours that the doctor was going to continue as the director. He was glad about it, but fearful that somehow the doctor would find out about his conversation with Chang. Andy and Bill, dressed in their fatigues, were already mounted and, leaning on their pommels, observed the spectacle with some bemusement. Andy's shoulder and buttocks still hurt from the stitches, but he had insisted on coming along. Their horses crossed Parliament Square, dipped into the dry ditch which was the River Tyburn, and took the track through the tunnel of trees up Whitehall. It was only a kilometre or so to Mandela Square, and it was another brilliant morning. Blossom poured off the bracken and flowers carpeted the woods, while insects danced through the shafts of dappled light that spilt through the canopy of the trees. Lal rode alongside James, while Andy and Bill paired up at the rear, with Bill's hound contentedly zigzagging behind them. They rode in silence. This was a lane Lal took almost every day, so he hardly noticed the cascades of greenery tumbling down the sides of the massive, decrepit buildings on either side. His thoughts were about Chang, the conversations on Larry's snares, and Fayong, who had not yet turned up. The silence was broken when James drew Lal's attention to a pair of large red kites which crisscrossed overhead, occasionally swooping so low as to break beneath the tree cover. He watched them circle overhead until they veered off and disappeared behind the old Admiralty. "So, what do you know about Mandela Square?" asked Lal, hoping to engage James in conversation. He shrugged. "Oh, not much, but I expect you're going to tell me." "This wood that we're approaching was once called Trafalgar Square, after a naval victory in the 19th century. Sticking out of that thicket there is Nelson's column, the admiral who beat the French. At its base, you'll find the heads of 4 half-buried lions. Grand place this once was, James. People used to gather here in their thousands for demonstrations to hear great speeches, democracy in practice. Do you care about such concepts as democracy? Trust it to choose your own leaders, or do you hold the opinion that it would lead us into chaos again?" James knew better than to argue with the doctor and start him spouting on about the history of democracy. "Well, sounds a great idea in theory," adding, "and of course no one wants, what did you say, chaos again." Lal snorted and fell silent, and they broke into single file as the path narrowed up an incline, the branches and leaves brushing against them. "Here we are," said Lal, dismounting and taking his horse by the reins. He looked over to see Andy wince as he stood up in his stirrups. Out of habit he was scanning the vicinity. To the east he saw a party of men working on the spire of St. Martin in the fields, nothing out of the ordinary. He dismounted and took his weapon from his saddle holster and slung it over his shoulder. He handed Bill 2 spades, and picking up a canvas bag of tools they made their way up the slope to the main entrance. The grand portico, its 8 Ionic columns with creepers twisting around them, still adorned the National Gallery. The cupola too was also still intact. Yet Lal knew that behind the grand facade the building was in a state of extreme dilapidation. From his saddlebag he pulled an envelope in which was his 400-year-old room-by-room guide to the National Gallery. "I haven't been inside this place for ages," he confessed, and carefully unfolded the room plan. The paper was fragile and flaky. "This is the main entrance. The other one," he gestured with his thumb, "is down there, but that one is impassable. According to the map, that's where our fellow might possibly have left his satchel. See here," he pointed, "beside these toilets it says cloakroom. I would imagine that's where we should search first." "Well, looks like a rabbit's warren to me," was Andy's comment as he peered over his shoulder. "All those rooms." "Yes, I'd suggest we go this way." He traced the route with his finger. "And take care. When I was last here, I put my foot through a rotten floorboard and cut my leg." "Well, it shouldn't be too difficult," said Andy dismissively. "Old buildings are always dangerous. We'll just have to negotiate our way around." Lal looked up at the portico with some apprehension. Several large blocks of stone had tumbled down and lay smashed at their feet, while others hung precariously over their heads, held on, it seemed, by only roots and moss. He took out the keys. "Well, I don't think you need those," said Andy, yanking off the lock and chain which bound the rusted iron gates and held them up. "Broken." He looked around the ground and picked up small bits of lock and rubbed his fingers in the fresh grooves scratched into the gates. "My guess is a crowbar or something like that did this." Lal and James stared at the broken lock and chain dangling from his hand when they heard Bill's dog give a low growl followed by a snitch as Bill loaded his weapon. "He's picked up something," muttered Bill to Andy. "Let him go in and sniff around first. Come on, boy." The dog bounded up to its master, its stubby tail wagging, its tongue dangling from its heavy jaw. "Go look, boy." He dragged the gate open. The dog slipped in, disappearing inside. Andy, holding his forefinger to his lips for silence, went first, followed by Bill. "What about us?" asked Lal softly. Andy gestured they should follow him. They entered into what had been the main foyer. It was dark. They took several paces up a slope which had been the main staircase, towards what had been the central hall. Here it was roofless. Over the doorway Lal could make out the sign, "Early Flemish Paintings." They waded through nettles and brambles into the next room. Andy turned to Lal and asked quietly, "Which way now?" He consulted his plan. "We have to go straight on through 2 more rooms, then turn left." It was then they heard the dog barking. "He's found something," said Bill. He signalled to Lal and James to stay put while he and Andy put down their bags and strode ahead, guns at the ready. Shouts were heard as the dog's barking turned to a snapping and a snarling. There was a cry. It was sinking its fangs into an arm or a leg. 2 shots cracked out, and the barking stopped. "Bastards," swore Bill, and they both broke into a run. At the next room Bill stopped and looked around the corner left and right. He saw a trail of trodden nettles. Someone had come that way. Bill and Andy crept in, their guns held at shoulder level. "What's going on?" whispered James to Lal, and looking distinctly unhappy. "Better we keep low and leave it to them. They know what they're doing." My God, thought Lal, do I look as scared as he does? At the end of the room, Bill peeked around the corner. A shot sounded and a bullet winged off the wall above his head. He sprang back. Jesus, that was close. Andy crept up to him. "Did you see anything?" Bill shook his head grimly. The shot had been a good one, ricocheting barely a hand's width above his head. Andy waited and listened, now wishing he had brought along a more powerful weapon. He thought of using his radio to call up for support, but these firefights he knew would be over in seconds. He decided to bluff it out.
"This is the London Border Guards. We've been tracking you. You're outnumbered. We have you surrounded. Say yes if you understand."
He waited for a response. None came. Only one man's shouts had been heard, but from experience, these gangs usually worked in 3s or 4s. Andy mouthed to Bill to repeat what he had just said. 2 different voices would indicate greater numbers. They might think they were up against a full troop or more.
"Listen, fuckers. This is the London Border Guards," roared Bill, with full venom. "We have you fucking outnumbered. If you're half as smart, you would fucking come out with your hands up. Do you hear us?"
He looked at Andy and shook his head. Andy signalled to him to carry on while he got down on his haunches. With his weapon close to his chest, he wanted to take an eyeball for himself.
"This is the London Border Guards," yelled Bill, watching Andy about to stick his head around the corner. "You're outnumbered."
In a split second, 3 shots rang out. The first zinged off the wall close by, and the second and third were the dry coughs of Andy's weapon.
"Grenade!"
screamed Andy, throwing himself on the ground and curling into a ball. The next 3 seconds were the longest 3 seconds of the day. An explosion in the other room sent a shockwave through his body, leaving his ears ringing. When he opened his eyes, Bill had sprung up and was rushing into the room. Andy was 2 heartbeats behind, charging through the bracken, aware in his peripheral vision that he had just leapt over a bloody and tattered shape. Bill was at the doorway of the adjoining room, on one knee and firing into the shaking bushes. Andy fired 3 shots in the same direction, past Bill and ran into the room, hugging the sides of the wall. He saw a man on his hands and knees trying to crawl through the nettles to reach safety before collapsing. He signaled Bill to hold fire, and with his gun trained on the man, walked up and gave a swinging kick at his head. Bill came up and rolled him over with his foot. The jaw was slack, the eyes half shut, the features Chinese. He had taken 2 shots. He was dying, gurgling as he tried to suck air into his lungs. Bill took a step back and booted him for good measure. He said something to Andy, but all Andy could do was shake his head, cup his ears and tell him he was temporarily deafened. Bill signalled that 3 others had got away, 1 also wounded. They agreed to pursue. Bill heard the crack of a gun, but several rooms away. They followed the trail of crushed nettles and broken stems. Entering the 3rd room, Bill spied a dark shape lying in the greenery and sprang back for cover. "Someone's there," he mouthed to Andy. He peered around the corner again and, reckoning it to be safe, beckoned him to follow. "Jesus, they've shot one of their own," thought Andy. The man lay on his back, his legs akimbo, with a hole in the centre of his forehead. Blood was trickling down one side of his head over his ear and pooling on the ground. An execution. He too was Chinese, and from his features probably hailed from one of the northern states. Andy knew it was not uncommon for looters to execute their wounded rather than to risk capture at the hands of the guards, but it was unusual. More unusual was that they should be Chinese. Most looters were opportunistic locals, living in the towns and villages which girdled London. Here any foreigner would stick out like a lily in a cesspit. Andy supposed that these might well be the same ones who had broken into his apartment. "Bastard," he thought. "Hit my lady, would you?" In his life he had killed, he guessed, at least 40 or 50 people. This was just another one, and he felt neither triumph nor pity. While Bill kept watch, he squatted down and searched the body. No identification, no money, no weapon. All he had on him was a flashlight and a plan of the National Gallery, similar to the one the doctor had. His clothes were practical and his boots well made. He decided he would relieve him of them later. He stood up and surveyed the scene. What's going on, he wondered. What the hell's going on? They continued to follow the trail and came to a window. Like other windows in the building, the glass and frame had fallen out ages ago. Looking out, it was evident the escaping looters had jumped into the bushes below and had made off. They retraced their steps to find the doctor and James. It had been over 10 minutes since leaving them. They checked out the man both had kicked. He was now dead and carried a Chinese-manufactured firearm. Bill went over to where a brown shape lay. It was his dog. He got on his knees and whispered something into its ear. Its stubby tail gave several feeble thumps, and it whimpered, trying to get up. Bill gave it a stroke, then a pat, got up, and put one shot into its brain. Close by was a canvas bag in which they found grenades, extra clips of ammunition, and a lump of explosive with detonators. In the adjoining room, they came upon the 3rd corpse, the one Andy had leapt over. It was disemboweled and headless. Both looked at each other. Who was going to get his hands bloody searching him? Andy grinned and, getting on his knees, rifled through the man's pockets. He too had a Chinese-made gun, but little else. Lyle and James had lain in the undergrowth and only emerged when they saw the other 2. Both looked shaken, and James had been reciting prayers most of the time. As Andy's ears were still ringing, he had to lip-read the doctor asking him, "What happened?" He led them to the headless corpse in the next room. Their faces paled in horror. Andy prodded the body with the toe of his boot. "This one was a pro," he said. "We were lucky this time. We're going to have to tell the police about this. Can't keep this quiet." Lyle nodded. "I'm also going to radio the guards for more troopers. I'm sure the 2 who escaped are probably skulking in the woods nearby. If I was in their boots, I'd recce the scene and lie low." He pulled out his radio, and after a couple of minutes talking, Andy turned to the others. "So if I've heard right, we've got an hour at most before the cavalry arrives. Until then, we stay put. You," he pointed to the doctor and James, "stay calm and keep your ears open and your eyes peeled." Andy stood guard at one doorway, with Bill hunkering down at the other. Lyle had to admire them. No wonder they'd made good mercenaries. But for him, it all brought back the terrors of his kidnapping in Egypt so many years before. He had escaped, but his wife and twin boys had been killed. Knowing that he was never cut out to be a man of violence, he forced himself to think of something else. He needed to keep his mind occupied. Above the doorway, etched in the stone and still visible, was XXX. When he opened up the guide to study the room plan, he was aware for the first time his hands were trembling. So this is room 30, 17th century paintings, he told himself. He made himself look at some of the 4 or 5 large ornate frames still hanging in the room. The paintings had long since rotted away, with just a few shreds of brown canvas dangling from them. So why hadn't these ones been rescued, he wondered. Spitting into his handkerchief, he proceeded to rub the muck from the nameplate. A dead soldier, Italian school, 17th century. Appropriate, he dryly mused, glancing back at the prostrate figure lying barely 10 meters away in the nettles, its shiny blood congealing. He did the same to the next one. The Tower of Babel, Leandro Bassano, 1557 to 1622. The third frame he wiped the dirt from was A Caprice Landscape with Ruins, Bernardo Bellotto, 1722 to 1780. Within the hour they heard voices calling them. "Over here," Bill shouted. "Just go straight ahead from the main entrance, then turn left." Within a few minutes, a dozen dar-faced guards were being shown the corpses. "Chinese," said the young lieutenant. He was a freckle-faced redhead, no more than 19 or 20. He sported a wispy moustache so that he might look as old as the men he commanded. "Yeah," replied Andy. "Odd." He pointed at Andy's shoulder. "You've been hit." It was then that Andy realized the stitches had broken and his wound was seeping blood. In the excitement, the adrenaline had numbed the pain. "Christ," he cursed. "Got that fixed only a couple of days ago. That's another visit to the clinic." The lieutenant, however, insisted one of his men dress it there and then. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The doctor was doing some research. Asked for our help." The lieutenant did not question Andy's explanation. As a part-time captain, Andy was senior in rank and a well-known character in the brigade. "And what do you think they were doing in here?" Lyle interjected. "I think they were possibly hoping to get lucky and find paintings in the vaults. But this place was cleared out centuries ago, as you can see." The lieutenant glanced about the room. He knew the doctor, of course, and deferred to his authority. Lyle, meanwhile, was anxious to look for the bag Larry might have deposited. There was, of course, the chance it might have already been found. He looked at Andy, sitting stripped to the waist, being stitched up. His body was flat and muscular. For the first time he saw that Andy was tattooed on his chest and back. "Lieutenant," he asked, "I'd appreciate it if you could spare some of your men to guard us while we continue our business." The lieutenant was happy to oblige and offered 4 troopers as helpers. "Thank you," said Lyle. "We're looking for equipment that might have been left in the Sainsbury wing." Another trooper came up, a corporal. "Found where they camped out, sir." The group made their way towards the rear of the building. In a room, on the floor, were laid out 6 ground sheets and sleeping bags. 3 firearms leaned against the wall. Scattered around were lanterns, torches, metal plates, mugs, a kettle and saucepans. Wisps of smoke arose from the white embers of a dying fire. "Made themselves at home," said Andy, buttoning up his shirt over his bandaged shoulder. "There were 6 of them, not 5. The corporal showed them to an adjacent room. It had served as their toilet. In a corner where the nettles had been trodden were piles of feces. They were here 2 or 3 days at least. 2 or 3 days? Lyle was alarmed that they had been there for so long. "How do you know?" The corporal squatted down. "Well, by the number of their turds, sir. Some are older than others." He rolled one over with a twig. "Seems these guys were trying to dig up something back there." He led them down a flight of stairs. He switched on his torch as they entered into a windowless room with the ceiling so low they had to stoop. In the far corner, 5 lanterns glowed beside abandoned pickaxes and shovels. A wheelbarrow lay on its side. He shone his light around the room.
Been busy digging up this place, and the 2 rooms alongside.
My God, they had certainly been industrious, Lal marvelled. Very industrious. Over the centuries, earth and mud had washed down the stairs and filled these rooms to a man's height, and so far half the room had been excavated to floor level.
"And here," said the corporal, leading them into another room, "here is where they dumped the stuff." "What were they looking for, sir?" he asked. "Like they were digging for hidden treasure."
"Yes," drawled Lal, reflecting that the corporal was a lot closer to the mark than he might have realized. "Must have thought there were vaults down there." He felt a nudge on his arm. It was Andy. "Found this on one of them." He led Lal up to the daylight and passed him the room plan he had taken from the body of the looter who had been dealt the coup de grace by his comrades. Lal opened it and orientated himself. The rooms which they were in had been circled. He shook his head. "Why here?" Andy scrutinized the plan.
"Well, it says toilets and cloakrooms."
"What?"
"Yes, there." Andy pointed with his finger. "That's the symbol for the toilets and the cloakroom, isn't it?"
"Oh, Lord!" Lal was aghast. "How on earth did I miss this?"
"Well, compare it with your other plan." Lal took the book from his pocket and unfolded the plan. They studied it.
"It's different."
"What do you mean?"
"See here," Lal pointed. "In my one it says archives. This is where the gallery's archives were kept, not the toilets and cloakrooms. So why are they different?" They compared both plans for some moments. It was Andy who noticed first. "It's a later one." "What's a later one?" "Your one, look here." He pointed at the bottom. "Your one says published 2068. Their one says 2053. Lal stared, dumbfounded. "Which means they've been digging in the wrong place." Andy's grin spread from ear to ear. "Means we're still in with a chance." Lal closed his eyes with relief and took a deep breath. "I think I read somewhere in this book that they gave the old place a facelift sometime in the mid-2050s. They must have rearranged the cloakrooms at the same time." He shook Andy's hand. "The gods are with us. When we get back, you and I must give thanks and worship at the altar of Bacchus."
"Sounds a good idea," replied Andy, less enthusiastically. That meant another of the doctor's drinking sessions. If ever a good man was in dire need of a bad woman, it was him. The guards secured the building, hauling out the corpses plus the kit the looters had abandoned. Lal, Andy, Bill and James, accompanied by 4 troopers, made their way to the Sainsbury wing. As they negotiated their way down what had once been a broad staircase, they lost the natural light and switched on their torches and lanterns. Lal began to feel distinctly uneasy. The place oozed with foreboding. Over the years he had developed a keen sense of when a building was safe and when it was risky, and this place smelt of danger. Fallen concrete blocks littered the slippery floors, and water could be heard trickling down its dank walls, forming stale puddles. "Don't like this place one bit," he remarked to Andy, skirting around some fallen masonry. He felt the same. "Yeah, it's like a tomb." Andy looked about. "The plan says this was the foyer and cloakroom area. This should be it." Layers of concrete had pancaked on top of each other. If Larry's bag was under that lot, then it would most definitely be crushed. Andy shone his flashlight up and down, left and right, searching out the nooks and crannies. He found what he was looking for, a crevice, and, getting on his stomach, slid and wriggled himself through. 5 minutes later, he called back to his companions. He had found a locker room, and it looked largely intact. The others followed, except for one guard who kept watch on the outside. 10 minutes later, Lal was hacking up the dust as Andy pulled him through and hauled him to his feet. The airless, fetid room stank like a dungeon. Andy let his torch sweep the area. The floor had sagged in one corner, collecting a pool of water. Andy's beam burrowed into the corners and recesses. "Bats," he said. "Can't see any, but their droppings are all over the floor."
"We need to break all of these open," said Lyle, as the light revealed rows of rusty lockers. "Place everything we find in the middle of the floor." He poked and picked his way through a growing pile of the usual detritus he would expect to find: rotten coats, wallets, purses, bags, electronic gadgets, and one mouldy book, which broke up in his hands as he thumbed through it. There did not appear to be anything distinctive that Larry Brubaker might have been carrying. It was then that one of the troopers dropped a dirty brown satchel onto the sorry heap. Lyle's heart beat faster. He immediately knew this was the one. As he picked it up, a strap broke off in his hands. Inside, he found 8 solid metallic balls, each about the size of a grapefruit, within 2 plastic tubes. "James, over here," he called. "What do you make of this?" The young man limped over. "Sweet Jesus, they're data spheres." "Data spheres?" Lyle passed one of them to him. "What on earth is a data sphere?" James studied it under his flashlight. "It's a Seagate DS-16. "A what?" "A DS-16, repeated James. 16 PXBs. Data spheres were basically the largest data storage devices ever manufactured. I've only ever read about them. They were produced in hundreds, not millions, unlike the other storage devices." "And so?" "And so it means there's probably more information stored on any one of these spheres than on all the other data stores in England, all put together." "Data sphere?" Lyle frowned. Could these be the fears that Larry was talking about in his call to Sanjay? "Fears? Spheres?" repeated James. "I don't know, could be." "Found what you wanted?" It was Andy's voice. Lyle realized the others had stopped working and were looking on. Yes, thanks," he said, aware that Andy's terseness may have been because they'd blurted out more than they should have. "Well, if you think you've got what you want, then I say we pull up sticks. Don't like this place." Lyle agreed, and after they had crawled out, he took Andy and Bill aside. "I want you to look after these," he said, giving Andy the data spheres. "I want you to hide these somewhere safe, very safe, where no one could dream of looking for them." He looked down at the ground in thought. "In fact, I know the very place. St. John's Chapel. It's most appropriate. Let's talk about it when we get back and after I've had a drink. I think I deserve one. You too." 20 minutes later, they were once again outside the gallery entrance. The troop was waiting for them. Lyle made a point of going up to each guard and personally thanking him. "And when we get back to the palace," announced Lyle, "you are all invited to have a well-deserved jug of beer on me." This offer was met with murmurs of approval. "I have to particularly thank you, Andy and Bill. You both saved our lives and," glancing at the satchel slung over Bill's shoulders, "saved the day." Then turning to the 3 bodies lying on the earth, half wrapped in ground sheets, Lyle asked, "So what's going to happen to them?" The lieutenant spoke up. "I radioed HQ. As they're foreigners, sir, the colonel asked us to fingerprint and photo each one." "Of course. Then we should burn them. Don't want them stinking tomorrow." "Fine." Lyle had only seen the corpse decapitated by his own grenade. "Who are the other ones? Chinese too?" "Well, appear to be," answered the lieutenant. He went over to the nearest ground sheet and flicked it off with the toe of his boot. It revealed an unshaven man with a bloated face. "And the other fellow was drilled by his own mates." He again flicked the ground sheet off him. The man lay staring at the empty sky, a hole in the middle of his forehead. "Oh, good Lord," exclaimed Lyle. "What is it?" said Andy. "It's the same man. The same man who was at the banquet last Saturday."